Hey folks, thanks for coming to Finding Warmth for Our Sun here at Maston 365. I am Matthew Browngan. I am taking actually a week off and, some R&R and all that fun things. But I hope you enjoy this rerun of episode with Nada Elmikashfi as we talk climate change, the climate crisis really, and really dig deep into, all of that and how we can move forward, as well as particularly centering racial justice within it and climate justice. So I hope you enjoy this rerun particularly if you missed it before or just kind of want to dig deep. So thanks for coming. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple Podcasts. And I hope you have a good week. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Good day, folks. This is Matthew Browngan with Finding the Warmth of Our Sun here at Maston 365. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. Hit subscribe and do all that fun jazz. Hope you're doing well. Today, though, we have our first guest, and we're going to be having a fun little conversation today. It's Nada Elmikashfi. I hope I got that right.
You got it right.
All right. We had a fun little one talking about last names before we really kick this off, but thanks for coming. So today what we're going to be talking about is really focusing on actually climate change of sorts. So I have this hypothesis of sorts. And a couple of weeks ago, there's some intersecting ideas that I talked about Obama's and Democrats' failures, week 17. And if you really want to see the roots of that, go ahead and watch and listen to that. But my hypothesis is that the next great or big global leader, as far as nation states, is one that is leading climate change, not military power currently like the United States is. So really, if the USA is serious in maintaining its global status, right or wrong as it is, it would adopt sweeping climate reform. Now, I went a bit deeper into this in episode 17, but Obama had really multiple chances to have sweeping climate reform. The biggest one was in his first 2 years when they had 59 senators, but there's an unwillingness to get rid of the filibuster. And they failed to pass what even at that time would have been a modest climate change endeavor in cap and trade. And even that was perfect timing because you had, the stimulus. You could have launched a full moonshot Green New Deal at that time and been perfect timing, wrapped into massive economic recovery and mobilization for the climate fight, but they didn't. And then you had the Paris Accords, where Obama was tepid and scared because he felt or he knew that McConnell's GOP-controlled Senate wouldn't have passed a treaty, but he didn't even fight that. He instead went into the Paris Accords, where global leaders were ready to embrace sweeping reforms and follow the United States if it was ready to pursue sweeping reforms into a massive global coordinated climate fight. But, he succumbed to failure already without taking to the Senate and didn't even push forward anything aggressive. So you had these failures. And now you have this Biden administration coming in. And you have the United States losing a lot of its global status. You have, nobody or really no major nations really stepping in and doing anything about it, or really kind of taking the charge. It's piecemeal. There's no coordinated global response that needs to happen. Again, and the U.S. still has 800 military bases across the globe and has a military presence in the vast majority of the globe, and has military personnel all across the globe. And I mean, to me, I see this as intersecting fight. But even then, in my view, is with this losing status. And if you have our leaders actually invested in the status of the United States, to me, it makes sense to invest in the next big thing and moving away from a failed military ideology of sorts. I don't know. Am I right or wrong, or am I going off? And I'd love to hear kind of your initial thoughts both about that setup and where you see it going.
Yeah, Matthew sent me the hypothesis of his about, I think, a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
I've been thinking about it for a while, and I think your first sentence was that the next great global leader is the one leading in climate change and not military power, which I completely agree with. But I think I would take it, another step further and say that the next global leader understands that military power is very much dependent on how we, counteract the climate crisis. It's dependent on our ability to control conflict elsewhere, obviously, and to promote peace and prosperity as a leading democratic nation, right? Democratic nation. But that peace and prosperity cannot happen without really mitigating climate change. And I think that, all scientists agree that a warming planet means, that food resources become scarce, that there's an increase in natural disasters, an increase in drought, increases in viruses and pandemics, like the one we're in right now, that kind of lead to global and regional instability, like we've seen with the Syrian conflict. Civil war was perpetuated by farmers being displaced because of drought, and moving to bigger cities, and social turmoil happening as a result of that.
And so similar thing in Ethiopia right now too.
And it's beginning in Sudan too, where I'm from. There's flooding that is wiping out crops, and that's wiping out a huge, food resource during a time of incredible political instability. And so the climate crisis is a political crisis in its essence, and it's leading to a lot of displacement, a refugee crisis, and one we aren't built to kind of handle. And so the biggest failure, in my opinion, and maybe we're jumping the gun on this discussion already, of the Paris Agreement was that no leading power, said, here are the countries that are going to take in I think in 2016, it was 65 million people that were refugees and displaced by climate crisis, political turmoil. So,
and I remember, sorry to interrupt, I also remember reading not too long ago that climate refugees have overtaken war refugees as far as our largest population of global refugees.
Yeah, they have. And the truth is that the countries that pollute the most, like the US, those in Europe, are not willing to take responsibility or accountability for how much they've perpetuated a warming planet. And so the xenophobia, the racism that you see in France, the home of the Paris Climate Agreement, two North African immigrants that are fleeing from what they all sat at a table and pretended they were going to fix, it's hypocritical.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to many of the reasons why I don't like Obama. Am I allowed to swear, by the way? Because I had to stop myself a couple of times. But
no, you're all right.
I'm not. In the most generous of terms, we are effed if we do not get our stuff together when it comes to climate.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree. I 100% agree with that. And it's not even for a lack of technology. Some of our leading scientists, climate scientists, have just released that the technology is there to fully convert to renewable energy in this country within 7 years. But when we talk about climate solutions, or at least within context of the Green New Deal, it's also within the context of mass mobilization, jobs, federal jobs guarantees, these things that are directly impacting people's lives, particularly right now, as we have millions of people out of work, millions of more people are out of work than there are actual jobs available. And so then that gets back into even some other aspects of everything intersecting with climate change, of being an economic issue. I mean, if we don't address things now, it's already costing us more money than it would to actually invest in the Green New Deal. So this whole argument of it takes, where the money is going to come from. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me, because we're going to spend the money anyways. And of course, it's a economic and social justice issue. It just kind of runs down the line.
It's very interesting who cares, right, about the climate crisis, and who sees it as the urgent, conflict that it is. And it's usually people that are hit, hardest by it. Marginalized communities, young folks that are looking at the planet as being uninhabitable when they grow up, whereas middle class, upper class, insulated, mostly white America doesn't really see it around them. They're not, in rural Wisconsin where flooding has really harmed their economic output for the past however many years. They're not, in certain areas in California where, fires have burned people's homes down. They're not in Flint, Michigan, where water quality is still... Can you believe that we got a vaccine before Flint got water? And I saw that in a tweet this morning, and I was like, that just...
But Obama drank some filtered Flint water years ago.
Oh, never mind. Sorry, I made it okay. But that's the thing, like for the 1% that is
absolutely
the biggest contributor to climate, change and a warming planet, the urgency is not there. It's seen as a problem that, they can ignore. They can say, oh, these young people are really loud about it. But Black, Indigenous, people of color, and like marginalized communities are going to bear the majority of the burden.
Absolutely.
And so I personally think that it is at its root like an environmental racism crisis.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's going to define the Biden presidency. Trump left the Paris Climate Agreement. And so I think it's going to take about a month for Biden to rejoin it. But there is so much work to do. And I'm very... I don't want to say I'm pessimistic about the future, but
you see how large the problem is.
Yes, very much.
And the lack of needed action.
Yeah.
That's like, it's just like the actions that have been taken so far have been absolutely minimal. Even in the context of their time. I mean, the type of stuff that even like cap and trade, if that was done in the early 90s and a couple of other, things that can be even difficult right now to get folks on board with, you'd be all right. But we're so far past that it just, people are scared of the big words like social, like all these weird things. It's like we're just past so many of these other middle of the road solutions. We just are. And that's really, again, where I fell back on that the next global leader or global leaders, moving forward are going to be, whoever it is, the ones that are willing to not just embrace those, these big action pieces, but also a willingness to embrace how cooperative it's going to need to be. Like this, it can't be just one nation, taking a big thing or saying, here's our technology. It has to be a coordinated, cooperative effort in sharing technology, sharing logistical resources, sharing human knowledge and resources and patents and, so many, other things, as well as, even though the technology is there, particularly for the United States, globally, it's, a lot of things are going to take need a lot of innovation. And it's like this intersected with an interesting conversation I had actually with my financial manager on how I was like, I want to get money into particularly, like Northwest African tech stocks, or just really like some of these nature, like partly because what I feel what you're seeing and is a creative innovation and cooperation, and the starting the growth of this cooperation as the lingering foot of colonialism is slowly being lifted off, and you see some of these nations slowly gain more economic independence from situations like the World Bank and the IMF, which are totally oppressive in their nature. But you're starting to see these, nations starting to break away and starting to cooperate with each other. And to me, just from a historical perspective, that's exciting, because when you see those types of things in the long arc of history is when you see the explosion of
a renaissance.
Right. Like, like you just, interestingly enough, I was one of the main hit from this was reading the book called The Silk Road, and was studying really the history of antiquity through the lens of the Silk Road. And the hit of this came when it started digging into the rise of Islam, and how, Islam originated from really kind of forgotten parts of really the Persian Empire, and less known parts that were forced, and communities that were forced into social innovation and cooperation because of internal and external pressures on themselves. And then you had this explosion happen of basically a brand new civilization that arose out of being forgotten with internal external pressures being forced upon them. And so that's like, where is this going on right now in the global south right now, and I think you're seeing it in India, and you're seeing it in parts of Africa. And I don't know, like that, I find it exciting in a analytical sense. In a human sense, it's like, humans are being like, these are real human lives that are, forced to innovate because of suffering and oppression. But yeah, in that historical sense, it's exciting. And I don't know.
It is. And I think it relates a lot to climate and the resource scarcity that we're seeing. And I think that the farther that hopefully we move away, as an African, I have very deeply embedded feelings when it comes to colonialism. My grandpa would tell me stories about the British, like he lived that. And so for me, seeing Sudan, at one point, it was the largest, manufacturer, I think, of cell phone data or something, or cell phone networks in the entire Middle East. For me was an incredible show that with a little bit of economic prompting, you could give these states that were colonial and really, really hampered by the West agency and kind of carving out their economic future. And I think one moment that I will never forget in like my academic career was like reading this. There's like a saying in humanitarianism where they're like, oh, don't give an African, or don't give like a refugee or someone, don't give a man a fish, give him a fishing pole and
teach a man to fish, not right.
Yeah, that one. And for me, it was so incredibly patronizing when I read that. Because I was like, if you're talking humanitarianism in Africa, are you going to talk about how, that water has so many different interests, fishing, and taking all of those resources away? So when the man goes with a fishing boat to the ocean, he actually doesn't find anything. Like, there is so much, I think, deeply connected with colonialism and racism, imperialism, and slavery that we really need to, I think, kind of detangle if we are to fight the climate crisis in a way that gives agency to those communities that are affected by it the most. And if we're going to take it back to the climate, agreement that happened in Paris those years ago, the U.S. pledged to give $3 billion to help those countries that suffer the most from what we here in America, do to them, which is really emit a lot of carbon that harms them more than it harms us. And so
that's like the price of one of our drones bombing.
Is that a price of
bombing one of those same nations?
So. Literally, like the F-35s, I think that's how much it is. When you think about how, like, we spend trillions on military, whatever aid here, and our military in the US, but we can't even take the responsibility and the accountability to give reparations for countries that are absolutely screwed in a couple years' time. And so
absolutely.
What I heard when you were talking at first about why, the US didn't take these bold stances when they really have no choice to, because we do not have another planet. I think, and I love talking about this, that the Democratic Party, the powers that be, really are married to this idea of incrementalism, right? Like, we will get there in steps. And they see incrementalism as the ceiling, not the stepping stones to structural reform. And so I think what you see from the left and from people that are championing the Green New Deal, like Ed Markey and AOC, is this idea that incrementalism is not the ceiling. It's how we get to these structural reforms that we need by 2030. We need to decarbonize by 2030 completely, 100%, if we are to get anywhere near that 2-degree goal that we had in the Paris Climate Accord. We are on track to be at 3 degrees, I believe, or a little bit higher by 2050, which is, I think it's 2050. If anyone comes for me, if I got that wrong, I'll correct myself.
Approximate.
We are literally going towards the 6th mass extinction. And that is with an analysis of adding up all the goals that countries decided on the Paris Climate Agreement. We are not making ground on what was already unsatisfactory when we agreed to it in 2016 or whatever. So the US, I think, inherently has to reject incrementalism and say, all right, we're going to police power this. We're going to have some means of enforcement because the Paris Climate Accord does not have enforcement measures. We're going to bring Russia to the table because it is a superpower that isn't there right now. And we're going to figure out how to pay reparations and make sure that everyone is doing their fair share. Aside from that, I can generously put it, if we don't do that, we are royally fucked. Like, no planet B.
No. And I mean, rolling back to your point about the rich too, like, don't they realize that, the entire global economy is facing collapse because of climate change? Like, everything they have and accumulated. And I think some of them you're starting to see, like the fact that so many of them have bought bunkers, right? Like there's a fear there. And I think, some do it, but they're just, there's some real cognitive dissonance. And I think fearful, even among Democratic leaders outside of the cognitive dissonance, in that to do this, so much things in our society are going to have to change. At every level. I think that's scary for even our lawmakers, to really, scary and hard to wrap their head around. I'm also gonna be real, and I think you know this as well as through your experience. Let me tell you, folks, some of these lawmakers aren't that smart.
No,
and I'm not talking about like Ron Johnson. He's like one of the worst of them.
Yeah,
but he's not that unique, folks. He's really not. And even like some of these Democrats that you might like aren't that smart.
No.
Their staffers might be.
Yeah,
they're not. They're just. They're not to
interrupt you, but like, this is my favorite subject. I walked into the Capitol as like this wide-eyed intern, and I assumed everyone was rooted in whatever opinions they had, but it was backed up by research and conviction that was based on facts and talking to their constituencies. There is a lack of imagination and creativity. And if Absolutely. I'm 23 years old and I'm giving legislators and administrations ideas that they implement, that is a big indication that people in there, can come from working class backgrounds, that do not have JDs, that are rooted in the issues that they've felt and they've dealt with. Absolutely. They can legislate better than the Ron Johnsons. And that Absolutely. Is, I think, the myth of government.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with that. You don't need to. I mean, that's like, it's just, some of this stuff is just being able, well, some of it is structural in the fact that like they rely upon particularly at the federal level, staffers and lobbyists, because they have to spend all their time fundraising. They can't actually stay up to date on some of this stuff. It's why when you see AOC in these hearings, she seems much more well-informed than her colleagues, because she doesn't do the same type of fundraising. Yeah. And she spends most of her time actually learning about these issues and what's going on. So she's able to like dig into it in a different way. So it is very much, it's a combination of things of the type of people that get into these positions and structural issues in funding and campaign finance, lack of imagination, the bureaucracy. I mean, it's a mess, and it's I don't know. It's hard for me not to be cynical and pessimistic. It's really hard. And
the worst thing that my therapist was like, you should not have studied environmental studies if you wanted to be happy, because like, oh my God, there is, and it is so intrinsically linked with economic problems, political problems, social issues as well. And so I think that we completely underestimate, much to our own detriment, the effects of the climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard because the United States, this is not the global problem, but we're so individualistic. But not just that, the pure essence of our economy is built off the back of extraction, extracting human labor or resources to maximize profits, not in anything, and even just the mentality of it. Because I think there is a way to think about growth and production in a way that isn't about maximizing growth and production, but is about sustainability. And you see some of that mindset in that idea of the closed economy. But even then, when I start thinking about some of this stuff, and even in the intersections of, I've had some of these conversations with some of my self-described socialist friends. I'm more of an anti-capitalist. I try not to subscribe to ideologies and more so try to look at like what are the paths forward to address these problems and how best can we allocate resources to address these problems. It just so happens a lot of times it's going to take a central government effort to best be able to do it, a centralized governmental effort, which can be subscribed to socialism. But one of the biggest issues that I have, particularly around climate change, regardless of ideology, is that we're not, regardless if it's a more socialist centered or capitalistic centered, we're not looking past the core problem of a production centric society. I don't think what we're seeing coming out of some of the more left wing, more social wing of Democrats and ideas, particularly the ones that are permeating into policy ideas, is something that breaks free of us focusing on production. It's still on like who it might be centered on or who might benefit the most from production, right? Who owns the means. But I don't think we can survive if we're focused on production. I just don't see or at least in the long run. To me, that's the longer run problem where, immediately we can start moving and decarbonizing. But until we start shifting our mindset toward away from a production centric, away from resource extraction, and start thinking about core aspects of a society that supports humans flourishing in a human way, not in a materialistic way, but in the psychological and physiological way of, what makes a healthy human, what makes a healthy human family, human community, and city. And some folks might be weird about that human centric, but in my view of human centric, it's not one that removes us apart of nature. It removes us from nature or makes us separate from nature. It puts us as a part of nature, and understanding that if we embrace the natural world and sustaining the natural world, we also help sustain ourselves. And you getting to the idea that this is the one planet we have. Yeah. And it's not, and currently we're not living in an ecological, sustainable way, which then supports humanity. So I don't see that like as the centering of human needs as something that's inherently ecologically destructive.
No. I think capitalism is inherently ecologically destructive, right? Because it is the idea that we are going to use the earth to make money. Yeah. At the end of it, for the 1%. It's not even for everyone. No. Right? It's for like the few rich people, and then like everyone else, make do with whatever is left. And so I think we really, if we want to enact bold progressive changes that kind of match the scale of our crisis, we really do have to challenge the fundamental assumptions of like our capitalist and neoliberal societies. And I don't know for much of America if that's possible. You saw with the election, socialists becoming a bad word, hurt Biden in Florida. And so I think that there is a very much a marketing campaign
Absolutely
that needs to be had when it comes to climate change and climate reform and climate justice, in that we show people that they deserve to be put first in these communities, in these, scopes of government where they are the policy. The policy, rotates around making sure that, environmental racism doesn't happen, that makes sure that Indigenous rights are first and foremost every single time, that makes sure that we're, really looking at, like you said, the human value in this crisis in a way where it's like, you deserve to have happiness and prosperity and sustainability. Not that, that is dependent on how much you produce for whatever government you are a part of. And so that's, I think, a shift in philosophy that I think needs a really big turnaround in what's happening on our planet. I think maybe COVID might be that trigger for us to really think, like, look, the economic, political, social safety nets that we were told we were buying into when we paid taxes, they weren't here to catch us when we really needed them. And so how do we start really making that structural change that kind of moves us away from capitalism and the evils that it kind of propagates? But again, not to make this sound very pessimistic, but that's gonna be a stretch and a reach. But I think that there's like a very important tenet when it comes to law that I learned very much, that we can use the American Constitution as young people to really push that through. And there's this, I'm going to look it up so I don't mess it up. There's like this idea of intergenerational equity, right? Where the Constitution inherently protects the youth climate activists and their rights in the future. And the preamble says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." Right? And so posterity means future generations. So essentially, and in writing, legally, the protections of the Constitution extend past every citizen now to everyone that comes afterwards. And so if you're looking at stuff like the U.S. Public Trust Doctrine, where it says the federal government is responsible as a trustee for environmental assets that are held in the broad public trust, you can very much argue that we have a duty to protect public land and the earth and the United States and its climate for future generations. And so I think that this argument has based a lot of the Supreme Court cases that have come out, where youth activists are literally suing the United States government for infringing on their rights. So I see some sort of legal, action that we can take there to really kind of hold our capitalist society to task for what it hasn't done for us. I see young people running for office as a solution, really seizing the means of production in government by being at the table and making these laws. So there's a little bit of hope there.
That's great. I mean, that was great, because I was about to ask you, like, what do you see as the path forward? I think immediately for me, it's they're all there's all that, but it's one, the Georgia runoff has to be won. If there's in my eyes, like, any hope of anything, I'm like, that has to happen. But yeah, like I just have a tough time finding that possible. Where I do find it is in kind of looking at not kind of, but is looking at the youth, is, I don't feel that old, but, in 35, I'm an elder millennial. And, but Gen Z is like kicking butt. And I know y'all look at us millennials a little weird, like, y'all really like them. But there's also, as a Black, though, Gen Z and millennials are the largest voting Black in this country.
Yeah.
Or Pasco voting Black.
Yeah.
And which there's going to be particularly of us elder millennials, or a growing rise of power and electoral power, particularly as more of us get into office and leadership positions. And I don't know what's going to happen if the Georgia runoff. If the Georgia runoff doesn't something, but thank you for that in that pointing out that little bit of hope, because it can be tough to hold on to. And one of the biggest things I do want to point out, because there's going to be definite folks that are thinking about, recycle more. A lot of folks love to point to individualistic actions. I support those, but that's not going to solve it.
No.
The magnitude of this problem is far beyond individuals, and the and not just that, but the majority of pollutants and causes of this stuff are industries. Don't shame people that don't individualize their actions.
Yeah.
And a lot of folks, and let's be real, a lot of individualizing these actions isn't necessarily easy to do, particularly if you don't have resources.
Yeah. Being vegan isn't easy.
It's not easy. Even if it's you could say, well, it's not expensive. It also takes time and mental effort to plan this stuff out. And if you're, hustling to survive and trying to survive that day to day, even if you might be able to afford a vegan diet, you might not be able to afford the mental space to plan a vegan diet. There's a variety of different types of resources that it takes to do some of this stuff. And it takes effort in a real way. And the best way to make it so that individuals can do these things is to make them so they're not cumbersome, is to build the institutions, is to make these system changes so that you as an individual don't have to think about making these individualized choices. It's just built into your everyday behavior because of how easy it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And that way you impact everybody. You don't have to shame anybody. And it's just easy. It's a social-wide change, right? So for folks, I really want you to break away from thinking about your individual actions. Not saying don't think about them, but as you advocate for, climate action, don't advocate on the individual level, advocate on the systems level. Don't advocate for individual things to be done, advocate for system-wide changes and institutional changes and government investment. Don't worry about plastic bag bans, worry about, investing in public transportation and reducing plastic use in concrete, reducing plastic use elsewhere. And there's a growing industry of not just of potential plastic replacements too. So there's real ways forward to this. And there's a good legal way forward on that. But I don't know, Nada, if you have any last closing thoughts, as well as anything you might want to plug before we say goodbye.
Yeah, when you were talking about age, I just remembered that Joe Biden yesterday nominated Michael Reagan as head of the EPA, and he's 44 and the youngest person to be ever nominated, I believe, for a cabinet position. Actually, I think Pete Buttigieg might have been one, but
he's not 40 yet.
I pretend that Pete doesn't exist as a person. So
he's also balding, but we're going to ignore that. Those are plugs that he has going on.
Horrible to Black people, but there we go. So I think that truly, if we do want to change structurally what's happening in our country, we really have to run for office and be at the table where these power holders are really making decisions based off whim and based off political expediency. But if you're running and you're in an office to serve, you will fight for things like making sure that Indigenous people have the right to protest pipelines that go over their land. That's a bill that passed in Wisconsin that was bipartisan, right? That was co-sponsored and proposed by Democrats and progressives. Progressive. Sorry, I have to do that. So I think that it's so important that we all are really paying attention to what's happening in our governments and running for office. Don't use straws, but also, if you can, tune in to what's happening in the Capitol, because as we speak, they're rolling back PFAS regulations that literally poison people on the east side and poison communities of color. So there's a lot to do, but if you're loud and you're persistent, you can alleviate some harm. And I think the collective effort of that hopefully will get us to decarbonization by 2030. So
all right. Well, thanks. Thanks for joining us, Nada. That's going to be it for this week on Finding the Warmth for Our Sun. I am Matthew Browngan, your host here at Masson 365. Please hit subscribe on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Keep your mask on. Vaccine's still going to be a little bit for most of us folks until early spring. So stay safe. And you don't have, if you're Christian, you don't have to cancel Christmas. But, do it over Zoom, mail your gifts, stay safe. I'm staying away from my family and protecting my health and my parents' health. Do the same. And so to folks celebrating holidays this season, happy holidays. And this, I don't think I'm going to see you folks next week. So I'm going to take a couple weeks off for Christmas on all things, as I'm a kind of Christian.
Hey, we Muslims miss 2 Eid, so you guys can miss one. Also, we also don't have any other holidays except those 2. So, come on, let's all share.
Okay. Fair enough. That's true. That's true. There is a lot of holidays around the season, folks. And to anybody that does get a little weird about the happy holidays versus Christmas, there's a lot of holidays. It's just being respectful. It's not about canceling Christmas, just being respectful about the many different holidays this season. And even when we celebrate Christmas, it was put on this date because it was a pagan holiday. And the Romans, for all their horribleness, were also smart in their empire as they expanded, adopting cultural practices of those that they conquered, and bringing them in. And so the celebration of that pagan holiday was one of them. And then as they converted to Christianity, it made it easier for folks that were pagans to start adopting the new official religion. But also Rome was terrible and horrible civilization.
I always get a history lesson whenever I talk to you. Every single time I learn something new. So I love it.
It's great. It's good because you could find, such a good line up to, I don't know. It helps me understand.
Oh yeah.
Who we are and why we are.
Yeah, it has solutions for. We don't learn from our mistakes, though. That's the problem. Anyone who opens any book can find a solution for what's going on now, but we choose not to. So.
We choose not to. Nothing we're facing is actually new. Civilization's facing climate crisis. Well, this is the first time facing one that we caused as a species. Facing a climate crisis isn't new. Yeah. And the fall of civilizations in the face of a climate crisis is nothing new either, as a lesson to any decision makers out there.
It's not pretty. And sometimes they also end up in unfortunate places as well.
They do. Paris is known for that.
Maybe we should get off this before we go.
Absolutely. With that said, happy holidays. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thanks for joining.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good one.
This is 365 Media.